thanks for joining us for this Bookseller webinar on the global influence of the Arabian Nights, supported by the Sheikh Zayed Book Award. I'm Tivnan, managing editor of the Bookseller. The Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights as it's also known, was compiled during the Islamic Golden Age from folk tales of the oral tradition across the Arab world and beyond. When it was introduced into Europe in the 18th century, it became a sensation. Its immense legacy continues. A wide range of authors who have been influenced by the tales themselves or stories within a story structure, including James Joyce, Edgar Allan Poe, Angela Carter, Salman Rushdie, A.S. Byatt, and on and on. Even those who haven't read the Arabian Nights itself are undoubtedly familiar with it, from its countless adaptations, music, opera, and theater, to video games like Prince of Persia, and especially film and TV, from adaptations by highbrow directors like Yasmine, Disney's recent version of Aladdin, which is not a good film. With me to discuss the Arabian Nights and its legacy are three experts. Yasmin Seale is a writer and translator of Arabic and French to English, who translated Aladdin for W.W. Norton and is currently working on a translation of the Arabian Nights also for Norton. Richard van Leeuwen is senior lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Amsterdam, who has published widely on the Middle East and Arabic culture, including The 1001 Nights, 20th Century Brill. And Marina Warner, professor of English and creative writing at Birkbeck University of London, a research fellow at SOAS, and the first woman ever to be elected as president of the Royal Society of Literature. Novelist, critic, and historian, some of her work on the Arabian Nights includes Stranger Magic, Charmed States, and the Arabian Nights, published by Penguin Random House. Before we get into the discussion, just a bit of housekeeping for all you viewers out there, and thank you very much for joining us. We are going to go for about 45 minutes between panelists, but feel free to ask questions. We'll take your questions the last 15 minutes or so. You can do it by the chat function on Zoom, but if you could do it in all caps, this is what I'm told by the tech guys, all caps, and tag in all panelists in attendance. Thank you very much. Also, we will be keeping the video live, or I should say we'll be uploading the video again on our YouTube channel. We'll tweet out the link to that and perhaps an hour or two after this goes out. And so tell all your friends who couldn't unfortunately make it. And lastly, let me just take a quick moment to thank our supporters, the Sheikh Zayed Book Award, for supporting this. If you don't know, the Sheikh Zayed Book Award is one of the biggest Arabic book prizes, giving out 9 awards a year across children's, adult, and scholarly works that are written in Arabic or engage with Arabic culture. Our panelists, Marina and Richard, are actually previous winners of the Arabic Culture and Other Languages prize. Submissions for this year's prize are open until 1st October, and details are on the Sheikh Zayed Book Award website. But yes, let's get on with it, shall we? I think the first thing we need to do, I think, before we get into the wider implications and the long-standing legacy, is the work itself. Yasmin, since you're trying to be Arabian, would you like to just kind of go through the story itself, the story within the stories itself, some of the themes that are explored, and some of the tales perhaps within that are, some that are familiar to many people, but some not. And you don't have to take 1001 Nights to.
Sure. I should maybe say something about the title first. The Arabian Nights is the title that was given to the first English translations in the early 18th century. These were anonymously printed chapbooks called the Arabian Nights Entertainments. That was a made-up title. Many people still know it as the Arabian Nights, but it needs to be understood that that was a British invention. The Arabic title is Alf Layla wa Layla, which means 1000 Nights and One Night. And as far as I know, in every other language, it's known as the 1001 Nights. So I prefer to use that title, partly because it's one of the most beautiful titles in the world, and also because it connects us to the history of the work. The Nights begin life in Arabic as a translation from Persian. This is around the 9th century. of a lost collection of stories. I'm sure we'll go into the history later on. And that collection in Persian was called Hazar Afsane, 1,000 legends. And this came into Arabic as 1,000 nights. And at some point, the extra night was added brilliantly to make 1,001, which is a number which suggests an infinity of stories. So that the title also tells us something about the structure of the work. I'll give a little bit of information about what the Nights is, which is a difficult question. It's not exactly a book. It's not one book. It's more like a tradition of stories which have been added to over the centuries since they were first written down. We could say it's a loose collection of tales which are held together by the framing story of Shahrazad, which might be worth summarizing briefly, though I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It begins like this: two kings, brothers, discover that their wives are sleeping with the servants and the cooks, and decide to set out on a journey to find out if anyone is more unhappy and betrayed than they are. When they come to the edge of the sea, they meet a woman who has been imprisoned in a glass chest by a jinn who keeps her at the bottom of the ocean and has briefly let her out so that he can rest on the shore. As the jinn sleeps, the woman demands that the two kings have sex with her, and also asks them for their signet rings, which she adds to the 98 rings she has already collected from all the other men she has slept with despite her captivity. The kings conclude that this jinn is even more betrayed than they are, and that no woman can be trusted. And so when they return home, one of the brothers, King Shahryar, has his wife killed and decides that every night he will sleep with a new woman and execute her in the morning so that he will never be betrayed. He does this for some time until there are almost no women left. At this point, Shahrazad, who is the daughter of the king's vizier or minister, comes forward and volunteers to marry the king because she has a plan. She insists on having her sister, Dunyazad, with her when she goes to bed with the king. And as they're about to sleep, Dunyazad asks her sister, "Would you tell us a story?" Shahrazad begins to tell a story, but stops just as the sun rises, and the king is so keen to hear the rest that he lets her live another night. And in this way, Shahrazad goes on telling story after story. The stories vary enormously in length and subject and almost everything else. Some are hundreds of pages long and contain many stories nested within them. Some are extremely short. There are all kinds of different subjects. Some are tales of adventure and trickery and desire. There are tales of magic and mystery and wisdom, mysticism. Many are set in Abbasid Baghdad under the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Others are fantasies set in semi-mythical places. Many stories, interestingly, mirror the situation of Shahrazad herself, in that they involve characters who have to talk their way out of danger. So it's really, although the collection is very diverse, it's all about the power of stories, the kind of magical properties of language. And together they form a picture of strangeness. Wonder and amazement are recurring themes. They make up a portrait of the strangeness and the diversity of the world and of human experience.
And just to come back on the 1001, the number of stories, and maybe we're going to go into the history and the context in a bit. But are there a canon of those 1001? Are there, or when did they become the 1001 stories that we're going to?
It's a really good question. This is one of the great difficulties. There is no fixed canon. It's almost an archaeological process trying to understand this text. which has really been built up in layers. There is a very old kernel of stories, which were maybe the stories that were borrowed from the original Persian collection, but then heavily adapted. And then many stories that were added over the centuries and reflect those times and those societies. And many different versions exist simultaneously. And we can talk more about the different translations later, but even contemporary translators are, it's a problem for them to decide which version to go by. So it's really a text that's characterized by a deep instability.
Really. Richard, can you come in now and perhaps just kind of unpack the sort of cultural context and the historical context of when the stories moved from the oral tradition into being compiled in written form, and then perhaps kind of talk us through how that gives us over 500, 600 years, but how that came to become brought to Europe and the wider world.
Well, first to avoid some misunderstandings, the collection does not contain 1001 stories. It's 1001 nights. This is important because one of the characteristics is that each night a story is interrupted and continued the next evening. So this is one of the important narrative strategies in 1001 Nights, which is very characteristic for this work. And another misunderstanding is that the stories are derived from the oral tradition. In fact, some stories are part of the oral tradition of storytelling in the Middle East, but most stories are part of written collections and written traditions from various literary traditions. So it's not a collection of oral tales. I think this is also important to say. As to the textual tradition, like Yasmin stressed, there's a lot of uncertainty about the actual origin of the stories and the textual formation of what we have now as a kind of corpus of the 1001 Nights. We have some references in the Arabic tradition to a work entitled 1001 Nights, but there's very little information about what the work actually contained and what the stories actually were. So the earliest version, substantial version that we have in manuscript form is a manuscript from the first half of the 15th century, which unfortunately contains only 282 nights. So people thought immediately that this would not be the complete version of the 1001 Nights. It's also sure that it's not the original version, the mother text of the 1001 Nights, because the tradition goes back much longer. But this is actually the core that Yasmin was talking about of the work that we have. And added to this was another corpus of stories, different collections of stories, actually mainly in the 18th century, to supplement the number of nights 2001. And the stories in this supplemental part are taken from different kinds of genres from the Arabic literary tradition. And I have to say also from not only the Arabic tradition, but also the Persian tradition and Turkish traditions. This is very important because especially in this time, in the Ottoman period from the 15th century onwards, there was a kind of confluence of narrative material from Asia to the Middle East and from there to Europe. But well, to come back to the place of the 1001 Nights in the Arabic literary tradition, it is quite sure, as far as we know, that the work was well known and popular in Arabic literary circles. But it did not really belong to what was considered as the canon, the main sophisticated genre of Arabic literature. It was rather considered as part of popular literature. Some even called it ridiculous stories about jinns and magic, etc. So it was not appreciated by all readers. But it probably, as far as we know, it was the stories separately were told in oral circuits, in libraries, and even at court. There is an Ottoman translation into Ottoman from the 17th century, I think, which was kept at the court in Istanbul. So it's all evidence that the work was quite well known and it was quite popular. But still, there are a lot of mysteries about the actual history of the text, the formation of the work as a whole, the origins of the work and the origins of separate stories. This is actually, at the moment, very difficult, even impossible to reconstruct.
And Richard, could you just kind of go through how it came from the Arabic tradition and brought into Europe? Obviously, French translation was probably one of the first ones, but could you just, why did it appeal to him? Why were people bringing it in?
Yes, well, the first translation is from the beginning of the 18th century, made by Antoine Galland, a French Orientalist. And he started translating in one volume by volume over several years, and it was immediately enormously popular. So the audience and the publisher especially requested more and more stories. So he kept on translating, and when he finished this first core, the manuscript that he had, this was the core collection of 282 nights. He supplemented the core with material that he could find in French archives and libraries. And in this way, he more or less created a European version of the 1001 Nights, which in fact has no Arabic equivalent. There were some stories added from other sources, and there were even stories inserted by other scholars who wanted to profit from the popularity of the tales. So there was more or less a European French version created of the 1001 Nights, which became immensely popular. Not only in France, it was immediately translated into Dutch, into English, into German, etc. So this more or less became the foundational text for the European tradition of the 1001 Nights. And the nice thing is that it contains stories which do not actually belong to the corpus of the Arabic corpus of the 1001 Nights, like the story of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. These are stories which were inserted by Galland in his Mille et Nuits, in his French version of the 1001 Nights. And it's kind of ironic that it's especially these stories that became so popular and so well known within the West, in Europe, whereas it actually has never been really part of the Arabic tradition of the 1001 Nights. But the procedure used by Galland became a kind of model for how to treat the 1001 Nights. And later translators also added material. They were quite unscrupulous in selecting the material, in adding new stories, in mystifying their sources. So a whole separate European tradition of the 1001 Nights emerged over time, which is very much characterized by the notions of the Orient in the period of the translation in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. So this European tradition is quite a universe in itself, because it shows so much about how attitudes towards the Arab world, towards Islam, developed within the cultural tradition of Europe. And they were also, they form a kind of chain because translations responded to each other. Each translator said, "Well, and my predecessors, this is rubbish. This is nothing. This can be done better." So they tried a new approach to the work, invented new things to make it more exciting or more fitting to reach an audience, etc. So this is a kind of field in itself. This whole history of European translations of the Thousand and One Nights.
And just quickly to get back on one of the things you just said, so those tales that Sinbad, Ali Baba, and Aladdin, which were brought into the European tradition, did they go back to the Arabic traditions? Is there sort of a circular kind of storytelling there?
There is. Storytelling has no boundaries or cannot be grasped or controlled. So there is a kind of circular movement. You cannot control it. Yeah. Well, it's also ironic that there are Arabic versions of Aladdin and Ali Baba, but one is even dated 1704, I think, which is 1 year before Galland's translation, but it was later proved to be a fake text, so it's made by a European Orientalist. Right. And the same goes for an Arabic version of Ali Baba, which exists in the archives, but this was also falsification. It was not a real, it was a translation from the French into Arabic. And so these stories became popular in the Arab world as well, and yeah, quite well known.
Yeah. Marina Warner, can you just talk us through some of the modern legacy of the Knights? Why has it had such an impact in both the West and the East? It continues to have an impact. And I mean, this is a huge question, but and why do you think it's influenced, as I said, in the introduction, so very high culture and very low culture?
Well, actually, I'd like to pick up on something Yasmin used, which is the idea of the voice in it. The fact that even though they are not, strictly speaking, oral tales as a literary form, they do carry a very dramatic sense of someone telling stories, and then the baton of the storyteller is passed on within the stories. So Scheherazade starts, but then someone within her story begins again. And this idea of an intrinsic, dramatic narrative with many voices, as I say, lent itself very powerfully and very quickly in the European tradition to the stage, and from the stage to films. Because when I was working on the Knights to write my book, I realized that I had never read them, not properly. I'd seen them in many different forms. And when I read the book, as translated, in different translations I read, it was the first time I had actually encountered many stories. And this, I think, could be tested with several of us. I mean, not you, of course, you've all read them, but there is the whole cycle of the Queen of the Serpents and Bulukiya, a wonderful enmeshed series of tales. Very little known, but you would recognize some of the themes. You would recognize the Queen of the Serpents because she has been borrowed by Disney. And that is really a clue, and that's been going on since the 18th century. The first pantomimes, inspired by the Knights, the first Oriental extravaganzas were staged in the 18th century, and then it continued, and you will be perhaps familiar with dance versions, with Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov, was put on by the Ballet Russe. All this feeds in. Even now, Ramadan, in Egypt, I don't know if in other parts of the Middle East, the children listen to watch on television dramatized versions of the Arabian Nights, which are freely retold with contemporary themes brought out of them. And that's the same with the very early pantomimes of Aladdin. One early pantomime even has a slavery theme, which the slaves are freed because it's happening approximately at the same time as the abolition movements. So the audiences would have recognized that these slaves of the lamp were probably slaves and needed to be freed by the power of the lamp. Again, rather Britain flattering itself that it was the owner of the lamp and the Enlightenment, but nevertheless, you can see the kind of way that the stories lent themselves to current themes. And the idea of entertainment, which is in the title, was part of the 18th century and then a 19th century fascination with inquiry and curiosity. So the strangeness in the stories meant that people were being led to places they had not been. These are wonder tales. They're the large category of wonder tales, the Oriental wonder tale. And that meant that you could travel on this magic carpet of the story into other worlds and learn things. And many of the stories in the Nights are kind of inquiries. You know, there is a story about going down to the bottom of the sea, Abdullah of the land, Abdullah of the sea, and meeting all the people who live under the sea. And that could be, and even the inventions of the flying machines in the Arabian Nights, of which there are many. There are birds and horses and so forth, flying on the carpet. This again is a kind of speculative dream world of inquiry. So it fits with that 18th century and then later 19th century desire to expand the world, to expand the horizons. But it's not primarily, I think, for a lot of people, an experience of reading. So it leaps out of its literary form in many respects, actually, because of all the different translations, the different versions, and the non-canonical status of any edition. But it also leaps out because it just streamed into, even the first theme parks were full of Oriental fantasies based on the Nights.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yasmin, let's perhaps tackle the translation question now. Richard said most translators think the previous translators were rubbish and they're going to try to fix. Is that kind of the way you're going about it? More seriously, how do you pick? Which work are you translating from, and what is your process that you're going about doing it?
I've just been by the sea for a few days and spent a long time looking at the sea, and it's a bit like that, trying to understand the Nights. It's like trying to understand the ocean. As I was saying before, there is no fixed text. It's incredibly slippery. There is no canon. I'm under contract to produce a complete translation of the Nights, but it's very unclear what that would look like. This wouldn't be a problem if I was living in another time. As Richard said, translators have taken many liberties. Until quite recently, translating meant adapting. You didn't replicate exactly, you changed it and you adapted it to the tastes of your audience, from the very first Arab writers who took these Persian stories and changed them and added a lot more new material, all the way through to Galland, who adapted the stories to suit the tastes of the French court. Galland also removed the stories he thought were too racy. Edward Lane also got rid of the sex. Richard Burton added sex that wasn't there, as well as his own racism and many other things, his own obsessions. So there's a long tradition of the Nights changing every time it's translated. But the contemporary taste is for completeness and authenticity. Of course, there are versions and rewritings, but if you're commissioned to do a translation of a classic text like this, you are making a claim to transmission and authenticity. But the question is what that means and what that looks like with a text that has traveled so much, and whether the desire for those things, the desire for completeness is what we should want from the text. What I would love to do is to be able to give an account of the journey this text has been on, and somehow to embed that archaeological quality I spoke about earlier in the text. It's a palimpsest that's been added to and written over 1,000 years. I love what Marina said about the fact that it's constantly leaping off the page, looking for other forms, other incarnations. I have fantasies of trying to make it as a 3D object, almost like a box rather than a book. It seems somehow unsuited to the flat page. I'm in a lucky position in that there are not all that many translations in English of the Nights compared to other great classics like, I don't know, the Odyssey. There are hundreds of translations. The Nights, you know, there are a few famous ones. The famous 19th century translations are all quite eccentric documents and need updating. The more recent translations of the last few decades have been done by academics into quite straightforward prose. I have nothing against academics, but I think that there is room for a translation that engages with the musicality and the rhythm, the rhythmic quality of these stories, which I think is just as important as replicating the meaning of the words. And I wanted...
You should perhaps say that Yasmine is going to be the first woman translator, which is really appropriate because it's a Scheherazadian act that she's involved on.
Well, there's the famous essay by Borges about the translators of the Nights, describing this competition between all the beards, all the bearded men who are trying to kind of outmatch the predecessor. So I like being the first beardless translator. But what I really wanted to do is to try and take seriously the idea that this is a performance that Scheherazade is engaged in. It's a kind of marathon of memory and physical endurance. At least that's the conceit, but I wanted to take the conceit seriously and to try and find a form for it, which got me thinking about breath and voice, as Marina said, that she's a kind of channel. You know, it's breath that has to keep going and that is always threatened with being cut short. She has to keep talking and spinning it out. And I was also thinking about the fact that these are stories told at night. There's a lovely concept in Arabic of samar, which is evening conversation, things that you say at night. So I wanted to see if I could create a night language or find some form to reflect the fact that this is a night work. And the fact that these stories take place where dreams should be. They have a quality that's somehow distinct from the life of the day. There's so much of it is about unconscious desires, strange things, strange visions. There's a kind of blending of the realistic and the supernatural that I think is peculiar to the night. So what that means is that the sort of formal decision I've taken is that each night is a single run-on sentence. And the idea is that if she were to stop, stopping would be fatal. There is no finality. Finality has to constantly be deferred. And so it's a kind of performance in itself, just to get to the end of the night is the feat. And I was also thinking about how we don't maybe speak in complete sentences at night. Night thoughts are more like phrases, maybe like musical phrases. So there was something interesting in when I stopped using sentences and instead moved into this other more fluid form. I found that I could have sort of musical moments within the line, which made it easier to recreate that effect in Arabic, because there is no punctuation in the Arabic, which is not peculiar to the Nights. This was true of all pre-modern Arabic texts, but it has a certain striking effect, which is that it's one thing after the other. And they're quite short clauses connected by and or then. So it really has this effect of, you sort of don't know where it's going to go next. And I like this idea of a sentence that runs on and keeps changing the subject, and resists or rebels against the units of attention that are the kind of daytime attention. Maybe nighttime attention is more wandering. So the difficulty and also the pleasure of this task is trying to preserve the fluidity of this text, its ocean-like quality, and not try and pin it down.
I think one of the aspects of, oh, sorry, no, Richard, you were saying.
Oh, well, just a small question, because I can hardly wait to read your translation. As you explained it like this. So how long do we have to wait? When will the first installment appear?
Well, I'm about halfway through towards finishing the complete thing, but I'm just now doing the edits on a selection of stories, which will be the annotated edition that Norton will put out, I think next year. That's just about done. And that will contain the most famous stories, let's say, selection of them.
I was going to add about the sort of nocturnal poetics of the nights, which nocturnal poetics is a phrase, a beautiful book by Ferial Ghazul, and about the book, is that actually it also, the night is also a time for the illicit. And that's not just the erotic, and that part of the magical strangeness where the stories take you is to areas of power that are kind of forbidden. I mean, the jinn are very ambiguous. They bring you great benefits, they bring you great blessings, but they also bring you great disasters. But when you're looking at a jinn who appears in a cracked wall where you've fallen asleep, you're looking at an area that is off limits. It is not part of the daytime world. And I mean, Yasmin's quite right about the unconscious and so forth, but it's also to do with the pleasures of the prohibited. And that is a theme of many, many stories, as we know from actually, Western fairy tales as well, the pleasure of the prohibition. And then the stories often look at the trespass against that prohibition and the dire consequences of it. But so that you, as it were, get a sort of satisfying, cathartic resolution to the act of transgression. But the stories take you into there are many stories about incest, for example. There's obviously these many stories about unjust murder, unjust tyranny, and so forth. So we are looking, we're looking at, the forbidden and the illegitimate and the dangerous. I mean, I remember Nasser Kemir, who's a Tunisian filmmaker, said to me, because I was asking him why it says, and it was the dawn, and so Scheherazade, it was forbidden to speak, Scheherazade fell silent. That's how each episode ends. And I thought, why is it forbidden to speak? And he said, because the day belongs to God and the night to us. So in daylight, you mustn't think about these forbidden things.
Richard, you literally wrote a book on the book, or on the Arabian, the stories' influence on 20th century literature in the West. Can you kind of unpack, one of the themes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you explored is the reluctance for people from the West to acknowledge sort of the influence that came from these stories. Can you kind of unpack that? Well, first of all, can you kind of talk how you think 20th century literature in general has been impacted by stories, and kind of secondly go on to that bit about how perhaps not recognizing the influence.
Well, yes, I think your scholars in European literary history are generally quite provincial, and they are very reluctant to acknowledge influences from outside the Western tradition, which is defined from antiquity through Spanish, French, English literature, etc., until the present day. And one of the arguments of my work is that, in fact, the 1001 Nights has had a very crucial, essential, systematic influence in the formation of Western literature from the moment of its first translation in the 18th century. And often the reception of the 1001 Nights is defined in forms of Orientalism and exoticism. And this is, of course, a very important element in the history, the European history of the 1001 Nights. But my argument is that the much deeper influence has to be found in the mechanisms of textual transmission and in the ways in which narrative strategies were adopted by European authors from the example of the 1001 Nights. The 18th century, of course, when the 1001 Nights appeared in the European literary field, was a period in which the modern European literature was still in a formative phase. People were experimenting and trying to find new modern genres and modern ways of expressing themselves and giving expressions to new world outlooks and new cultural values, etc. And precisely at that moment, the 1001 Nights became like a kind of alien intruder into the Western literary field. And immediately authors started using this material in their own work in different ways. And of course, one element was the exotic and the adventurous, because and the magic, etc., and the Oriental settings. But the other strand of the reception was much more technical and aesthetic, because authors started experimenting with the framework structure of the 1001 Nights. They were reusing the concept of the 1001 Nights, these different narrative levels which interact with each other, which is quite new. They started using the concept of infinity on the one hand, but also the idea of how do you say, equating survival with storytelling, and identifying with Shahrazad as a narrator. If my public doesn't like me anymore, then I'm finished. I'm done. My life is over as a writer. So the whole concept of especially the framing story. The framing story has a kind of magic because it's about the origin of storytelling. It explains why storytelling is required, is a necessity for human life. And it is necessary for neutralizing all kinds of traumatic experiences. It's essential for the interaction between men and women. And it's essential also for the neutralizing of violence, because Sharia has a kind of violent regime, which is interrupted by the intervention of Shahrazad. So the framing story, which is very, very short, actually contains a whole universe of definition of what storytelling is about. And immediately this idea was picked up in the 18th century by Western authors, because this is so essential for their own work as well. And it came at the right time, because people were thinking exactly about these things. What form should we develop for our literary expression? What is the relationship between literature, texts, and reality? What is magic? How can we define forms of the supernatural, which of course in the 18th century was very common, the idea that the supernatural was intervening in reality. So it actually helped shaping thought and literary expression in the 18th century to a very deep extent. And this has continued during the 19th and 20th century until the present day. It's still going on. Why? Because it represents such an essential idea, concept of storytelling, that every time that writers want to reset their literary strategies, their literary mind, and they draw on this enormous reservoir, this very rich concept of literature to experiment with new forms. So in the 19th century, and especially also in the 20th century, you see authors who want to develop new generic techniques, new approaches to literature, who immediately go back to the Thousand and One Nights and use the material in a new way. And we see this especially in the beginning of the 20th century also, when modernity became the framework for literary expression. The main writers who invented modernism in literature, they were deeply influenced by the Thousand and One Nights. And in the course of the 20th century, postmodernism, magical realism, etc., all were heavily influenced by the Thousand and One Nights. And this is the reason why I would say that the interest in the night, the significance of the nights for Western literary tradition is not just Orientalism or exoticism. It's in fact deeply interwoven with the texture of Western modern literature. It's in the capillaries of Western literature, and because of this structural, technical, aesthetic influence on the literary thinking and the literary methods of Western authors.
I think it goes even beyond that. I mean, in the sense that when I had thought before I started work on the Nights that the current reception, the theory of reception was that it was escapism, that there was a kind of almost condescending Orientalist attitude to this farrago of fascinating, fantastic, extraordinary, extreme tales. But actually, as I began to read more, I realized that they touch, in the same way as you said, very deep structures, but not only within literature, but within society itself, because this is the period when you start getting the word making things happen, and people being very concerned with that, not just judicially, but in a very major development of our contemporary world, the printing of money. Up to that point, money had been kind of real. It had been gold or silver or shells or something material. But then at the end of the 18th century, you get printed money. And the stories in the Arabian Nights are all about how the word can make things actually, it can charge ordinary objects with power. The jinn managed to transform material goods into magical, powerful instruments through the infusion of words, which is how you make paper turn into money, through the infusion of words. And actually Goethe even staged a scene in his Faust on this, because a sort of 1001 Nights kind of scene of enchantment, showing the devil making paper money. And this seemed to me that a very, a connection, all these phantasmic fortunes that are found in the Nights or lost in the Nights, either money comes and goes in a fantastic way. This was happening already, and as indeed we see it happening now, all the time in that modern world of financial systems. And the other respect in which the structures of the Nights leak out into what we think of as the essential modernity is that the power of dreams to reveal what is happening or to make something happen, that runs throughout the stories of the Nights, and some of the most beautiful stories in which the world dreamed and glimpsed in the night actually becomes has a prophetic effect on what happens later. And this is exactly the period when whose comes along but Freud, saying something very similar. He couches it in a different way, but he places on his couch, his famous psychoanalytic couch, a carpet, an oriental carpet, so that his patients in Alissam's are lying on a carpet as if they were about to lift off into this dream world where they might glimpse elements of the truth and help them in their next future state.
It's a story that's very flattering to writers. The idea that words would have such power to stop a genocide. You can see why writers would be so attracted to it. I very much like Richard's idea of the frame tale being a kind of origin myth for storytelling. It's, you know, there's a view of literature which is that it's the particular expression of the genius of a certain nation or a certain language. And the Knights really resists that kind of reading. It provides a different model for literature, which is much more about recombination and channeling rather than expression. There's a wonderful line by André Miquel, who's the great French translator of the Knights, who calls it un livre étranger d'un étranger multiple. So it's a book that's other, that's foreign, but of an otherness that is multifarious. It's a plural kind of otherness. It's a conduit, really, this work, for a whole host of different imaginative traditions. It's profoundly collaborative across cultures, but also across other kinds of boundaries, oral and written cultures, men and women, high culture and popular culture, and between the different moral universes, as Marina was saying.
Well, in the title of our panel is the term world literature, and I think The 1001 Nights is the quintessential text or corpus of text which reveals the mechanisms of what world literature is about, because it crosses boundaries, it incorporates material, it changes in the course of transmission. So yeah, it's more or less the incorporation of what world literature is about, the crossing of boundaries and the reshaping of literary fields and being reshaped itself through the literary field. So I think this is...
I wanted to ask Yasmin something, actually, which is that because it is fluid and it is combinatory and it is the product of this multifarious strangeness and strangers, are you going to change? There are aspects of the Knights which are very disturbing to us now. There's quite a strong streak of racism in it. Are you thinking of trying to retell the stories in ways that won't be embedded?
I am. It's a conversation I've been having with my editors for some time now. I think that the fact of this fluidity, as you say, gives the translator license to think hard about what are the stories that we want to continue to tell, and why do we want to continue to tell them, rather than uncritical deference to them. It's a work that's never invited and never produced uncritical reverence and replication. And you know, even from version to version, some of those details change. So you see how in some societies, some contexts, some editions, some of those aspects are more marked than in others. And there are even cases of translators, you know, adding their own prejudices and so on. So I think I would defend writing it for the 21st century.
Interesting. You asked that, Marina, because that's exactly one of the questions that from one of our attendees or viewers, I should say. And I realize we're rapidly running out of time and we haven't got to many of the questions yet. So I might dip into those now. And it's an interesting question that someone asked about what is the relationship, because we've been talking, perhaps this is our own, or my own sort of biases, but we've talked about the Knights' influence on the current contemporary Western literature, but what is the influence on contemporary Arabic literature, and why in the West do we still often talk about the Knights rather than perhaps more Arabic, contemporary Arabic literature? I don't know who wants to take that on, maybe Richard?
Well, The 1001 Nights has been, how do you say, influential in modern Arabic literature as well, but it has taken some time because it was not really considered as highbrow literature, as sophisticated literature. And so it was not the first corpus of literature that was that people looked at to be inspired for modern expressions, and people were rather looking at Western literature as models for modern Arabic literature. But then, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, there were some important Arabic authors and thinkers who took the Thousand and One Nights as inspiration for their work. And this was the moment when it was more or less authorized to use the work as a part of the Arabic tradition. So serious authors started to using the material from that period onwards. But there's also a strand in Arabic theater, in dramatic literature, especially comedies, from the end of the 19th century. Directors using the material as a kind of popular tales, easily to be reworked for the stage. And so this happened at the end of the 19th century. But it's important maybe to note that one of the incentives to accept the Thousand and One Nights as a serious work of literature was through the appreciation in the West. And so because in the West it was accepted as a serious work of literature, people in the Arab world said, well, apparently this is not contrary to the idea of modernity. So we can adapt this work from our own tradition, which we can somehow adapt to modern tastes and modern literary forms. But I have to say, on the other hand, that as Marina said, there's a lot of transgressions of moral boundaries in the work, and that there also has been a lot of censorship in the Arab world. There were a lot of countries where the Thousand and One Nights could not be sold without eliminating all kinds of words and passages.
I mean, I've read one or two, contemporary women novelists who use the modes of the Nights. I mean, Huda Barakat doesn't use one of the stories. She's a Lebanese who lives in Paris. She writes in Arabic. She doesn't use the actual plots, but she's interested in the idea of the voice of the storyteller, the healing effect, the ransom tale effect, that writing against history, writing to make up in the siege of Beirut. She writes these fantastic tales called The Tiller of Waters. The idea of the power of sexuality is very strong in some of this work. And it is the core of the Nights, of course, as well, women's sexuality. And that recurs in some contemporary women novelists in Arabic now.
Well, I see we have literally 1 minute left. So just want to, maybe Yasmin, you can finish this off. Someone asked, what is your favorite story in the Nights? So with 1 minute left, what is your favorite story and why?
I think it is the story of the porter and the three women of Baghdad, which is a wonderful story which combines a great deal of material detail about life in Baghdad. It begins with a fantastic shopping expedition in which all kinds of fruits and perfumes are described. It's wonderfully detailed and vivid, but it's also about language and the dark pleasures of language, and language being connected to sensuality, female sexuality, mystery, all these things together, which I think is characteristic of the Nights as a whole.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Time is up. Thank you, Marina Warner, Yasmin Seale, Richard Ben Leeuwen. Thank you. We could talk about this for ages, 1001 Nights, of course. And thank you to the Sheikh Zayed Book Award for sponsoring. Thank you. And thank you for all tuning in. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.